Jack Vowles is here today, and by way of introduction, he's currently professor of comparative politics at Victoria University in Wellington. He's taught elsewhere, both in New Zealand, the University of Auckland and Waikato, and also at the University of Exeter in the UK. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. He has served in the planning committee of the comparative study for electoral systems between 2004 and 2015. And currently he's the, I guess, are you the principal investigator of the NZES? Yeah, he leads the New Zealand election study, which is one of the better election studies, I do think so myself, in the world in terms of the data it provides. And since the New Zealanders tend to have an election about every 3 years, you get an awful lot of data from them. So you might want to check that out. And also, Jack's giving a little presentation on more of a technical, kind of informative nature on Friday at 10 over at the law school on this comparative study for electoral systems. So if anybody's interested in electoral behavior, in democratic participation, in these kind of issues, what people think around the world, you may be interested in this data resource that Jack will talk more about on Friday. So go ahead, Jack, and the floor is yours. We'll, I guess, go about 30 minutes or so, and then have some Q&A. So thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tim. Thanks to Tim for organising the fellowship. Thanks to everybody who's been involved in facilitating it. It's really nice to be here, and I'm really very grateful that you've turned on such great weather for me while I'm here too, which is it's a bonus. Okay. This paper has had quite a long gestation. It started when I moved to the UK in 2007. And I had done work on turnout in New Zealand, but I had relocated to the UK, and I wanted to have some research on British elections. At the time, my colleagues and I at the University of Exeter were actually thinking of trying to put in a bid for the British election study, which we duly did and failed for 2010. And so this was a way of getting into the data and establishing, if you like, a bridgehead in UK electoral research. So we started in 2007 and presented at a couple of conferences, got rather mixed results, and then of course the 2010 election happened, and so we added the data. But then the topic went a bit off the boil, and the idea of electoral competitiveness having an effect on turnout seemed to be pretty widely accepted, although there were some dissenting voices, and gradually the literature seemed to be turning against it and looking to other factors. In the meantime, we'd shifted the ground of the paper and were no longer really bringing electoral competitiveness to the fore. But then a colleague of mine suggested that we refocus again on competitiveness and put the paper in for a special issue of a journal that he was trying to organise, which was focusing on electoral competitiveness. We duly did so, and somewhat to our surprise, when all the reviews came in, ours was the only paper that actually gotten through the process. And but we also got told that we needed to up our game quite considerably, and in particular we had to improve the analysis, which we duly did. So, okay, that was by way of a brief introduction. So let's get on with the actual meat of the topic. So what this paper does is effectively follow in the footsteps of Mark Franklin, who wrote a very influential book on electoral turnout back in 2004. And so what we're effectively doing here is following in the footsteps of Franklin. We're modelling UK turnout as a function of the closeness of elections, the extent of party policy polarisation, changes in voting eligibility, the role of new voters, generational differences in voting behaviour, although that got a bit sidelined as we revised the paper, because that didn't seem to be what the reviewers were very interested in. What we were asked to do was up the game methodologically quite considerably, because we have 13 elections The British election study goes from 1964. 13 elections, obviously multi-level model is where you have to go, but 13 level 2 cases are not really enough to apply standard multi-level modelling. And the advice was that we had to go Bayesian. And we also had to be far more sophisticated in the way that we were modelling age period cohort analysis. And we had to effectively use a new method by Young and Land. So anyway, so Bayesian, MCMC, cross-cutting hierarchical analysis. So basically we're modelling on random intercepts at the constituency level, at the election level, and in the latter stage on age cohorts as well. Generalised linear regression, probit, and so improved methods, but also, and this goes back to the earlier draft of the paper, improved measures, because most of the previous literature had been measuring competitiveness in terms of differences in vote shares. But that really doesn't make much sense in the UK. Seat shares is what matter. And a lot of the previous research also tends to take competitiveness as measured at the election in question. But our argument is that you actually need to lag these variables back, because that's assuming that people actually know what the result of the election is going to be when they're going out to vote. And of course they don't. So the previous election is actually the one that really matters. Although of course polls can add some information. But as previous studies have done, we can of course incorporate those. Okay. So just a brief refresher on what Franklin says about competitiveness and what his model is. Franklin is not just focusing on closeness of contests. So when he's talking about competitiveness, he's also talking about differences in party positions and the rules under which elections are held. It's really about whether elections are seen to matter to people, which is a fairly obvious, intuitive feel about what prompts turnout or not turning out. Franklin's argument also is that all of these aspects of competitiveness might be expected to interact with the entry of new voters into the electorate. So new voters are particularly sensitive to the electoral context. And furthermore, these new voters are acquiring a habit in those first 3 elections, which they may maintain throughout the rest of their voting history. Okay, so we define the closeness of elections broadly in terms of the total effect on turnout. So it's not just this idea of pivotality. We accept that the effects of closeness are also going to be mediated by other variables. So voters themselves may be aware of the stakes and the closeness of the election, but of course they're also going to be mobilised by political parties, by candidates, by the media, and so on and so forth, and all of this percolates through social networks and may facilitate or not facilitate turnout. Okay. So just a little bit more on looking at the differences in seat shares rather than vote shares as part of the business of measuring closeness. I mean, this seems incredibly obvious, particularly, I guess, in the United States, when you think about contests, elections to the House of Representatives. As far as I'm aware, it's very hard to find out what the popular vote actually is for votes for the House. It's simply seat shares. But in the UK, certainly the popular vote gets a lot more publicity. But it's seat shares that really matter in terms of how close how likely it is that there'll be a change of government at the next election. And all the previous research seemed to just simply focus on the difference in vote shares. And it was only about halfway through the process that, suddenly a blinding insight hit me. And I thought, well, why are we doing this? Why are we following the existing literature? It's got to be seat shares. And so that's what we started doing. So all this is fairly obvious. It's seats that count. So what we do is we use a variable which we call lagged seat margin, which is the seat share gap between the two major parties at the previous election. Okay. We also model in local closeness. So the first variable is a national level, obviously, but of course closeness matters at the constituency level because Britain has a first-past-the-post electoral system, and there's quite a significant literature which shows that it actually matters for turnout. A lot of work that's been done on this in UK politics, David Denver, Gordon Hands in particular, various others. And so we also bring in the lagged constituency vote margin, which again is just simply the winner's margin over the second place candidate, pretty obvious. Another important thing to do, of course, is to take account of boundary changes, because there are boundary changes at, well, relatively irregular intervals, but nonetheless there have been a few in the period of the British election study. And so what we had to do was to get estimates of votes reallocated from old boundaries into new boundaries to estimate what the level of closeness would have been in the new boundaries as the result of votes cast in the old election. And this data is available, fortunately, although it proved a bit difficult to merge it into the British election study, because prior to 1974, a lot of the data was missing, and it took quite a bit of messing around to be able to get it all back to 1964, but we did. Okay, so a little bit more then on the theory and how we start to operationalise all of this. Obviously, expectations about the contest as shaped by polls are important. So we include in our analysis a last poll variable, which is just basically the natural log of the difference in the polls as averaged over the last week of the campaign, which has been used in the previous research on this. We also put into the model turnout at T-1. So in effect, our model becomes a change model. And this is basically because this is what Franklin does. And so we're, particularly after we got the reviews, it was pretty clear that the thrust was, okay, you should be trying to replicate Franklin. You should be seeing if Franklin actually works. Because Franklin himself hasn't actually tested his theory at the individual level in the UK. So turnout election T-1, a whole bunch of individual level controls, the usual suspects in turnout models, with the exception, however, of income, household income, which Franklin did not include in his models. And so, because the reviewers told us we needed to replicate Franklin, we removed that variable from our models. Okay, another very important point about the paper is that we also test the habit of voting hypothesis, not just by turnout at T-1. We also add a variable which we called initial seat margin, which is the closeness of the elections experienced by respondents in the first 3 elections that they were eligible to vote. So this is basically everybody, the assumption is that everybody's subsequent behaviour is to some extent shaped by the context they first experienced when they first began voting. Okay, we also look at policy differences because, again, this is part of the Franklin model. And indeed, this is one of the issues that we were probably most interested in trying to look at turnout in the UK. So right-left manifesto differences from the Comparative Manifestos Project data, and we use the revised estimates, which are apparently more reliable. But more importantly, we also were able to use a question that's in the British election study, perceived party differences between the Conservative and Labour parties, which is coded from the respondents themselves, giving their perception of whether there's a good deal, some or not much difference between the policies of the parties. And that's the question that works the best, and indeed it works very well in the subsequent analysis. Okay, now the first thing we wanted to do was just look at this on a bivariate basis. So we just simply calculated the correlations between the various variables across the 13 cases. And the two that are important both theoretically and because they actually work are the lagged seat margin, which I talked about earlier, and the mean lagged constituency vote margin. And the important point here is previous research on this topic, criticising Franklin, has said competitiveness is not a trend in UK elections. So there's no trend towards lower competitiveness. Therefore, decreased competitiveness can't be an explanation for turnout decline in the UK. Okay, so this is an article by Oliver Heath in 2007. So we actually just wanted to model this in a very simple way. And what you can see here, based on those simple regressions, is that actually there is a trend towards lower competitiveness. Obviously, it bounces around a bit, and particularly the constituency margin tends to go down a bit towards the end of the series, but there is this trend overall. And as a result, the claims that Franklin is making about how the electoral context when people start to vote may continue to have effects, if there really needs to be a trend to be able to make this argument plausible. And yes, there is one. Here, for those of you who like to see your model displayed in algebra, here it is. I won't bore you with reading it to you, but just to assure you that we do have a statement in the article which some people seem to like, which is expressed in this way. Okay. So what we're doing is interacting new voters, that is the people in the sample who are experiencing their first three elections at the time, with these competitiveness indicators. And what we basically see here, I'm not sure how well you can read the text here, because this comes from the paper, and the figures, I couldn't do anything to improve the size of the text. But anyway, the expected change in the probability of voting associated with change in methods of electoral competitiveness, lagged seat margin, last polls, lagged constituency vote margin, perceived party differences, and down here, the new cohorts, that is the people who are coming into the electorate for the first time, the first three times, if you like, and the established cohorts. And basically what this is telling us is that most of the competitiveness effects are on the new cohorts. The established cohorts, there's not much going on, which of course is what Franklin is effectively arguing. Although when we move down to perceived party differences, we see that actually there are effects on both groups. The effects are bigger. Well, actually, the effects are bigger on the new cohorts, but they're still quite significant on the established ones as well. Okay, so that's on the first model. And this is the model without initial seat margin, which basically codes for everybody in the sample what competitiveness was when they first started voting. So that variable is missing in this run of the model. So this is what happens when you add initial seat margins, and basically it's pretty similar. It's pretty similar. The adding that control doesn't make a lot of difference. We break this down into self-reported vote and validated vote, again, we're finding that the new cohorts continue to have influence, but also the initial seat margin also works quite nicely as well. So, okay, there is this habit of voting which is acquired in these first three elections, which continues. And also, just to make the point that this is a very conservative way of estimating this, because we've also got vote at the previous election, vote or not vote in the previous election, in the model. So to find these things with already measuring the habit of voting in that way, to find the initial seat margin still working is quite significant.
Okay. This is a point of clarification that when the margin is greater, it means that there's less likely.
Yes, 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 yes. Okay, so from the distance you're sitting, it might have seemed that a lot of those differences were quite small. You know, the effects seem quite small, but when you actually add them all up at various combinations of competitiveness plus perceptions of party differences, actually they can be quite big. So we've got estimates here for turnout, so it's 0 up to 0.9, minimal competition, maximal competition, and so basically we've set the values of the variables to their maximums and their minimums, so basically lag seat margin, lag constituency vote margin, perceived party differences, so absolute minimal combination, absolute maximal combination, and as you can see, well, so this is 0.9, 0.6, so it's what, about 15% difference between the two. This is where we add in initial seat margin as a control, and again you see there's quite a big gap, and indeed the gap actually widens. So we think that we've made a pretty good case that competition matters, and it matters in combinations of the parameters, all of which have been experienced. So if you like, these are the furthest range of the possibilities that have occurred over this period, and we're finding significant effects. Okay, now we've got a further extrapolation of the model, which is bringing in the random intercepts, the cross-cutting hierarchical analysis for the generations. And this is a model that also adds political efficacy and civic duty into the model. And again, this is something that one of the reviewers wanted us to do. I was actually opposed to adding these two variables because when you're starting to look at generational effects, the assumption is that political efficacy and civic duty are actually embedded in these generational effects. And so if you control for them, and if you're looking for generational effects, well, they're going to wash out. And, but nonetheless, I guess there's a case to be made that we're basically focusing on competition here. So we're effectively trying to control for everything that might reduce the effects of competition, and in that case, these controls are appropriate. So we've got cohort-specific effects. You can see so this is basically more turnout, less turnout, presumably deviation from the average over the period. And again, there's a cohort-specific trend, but the confidence intervals are way too wide to be at all confident about anything that's going on here. And some election-specific effects, which are simply about saying, well, we obviously can't explain everything. We can't explain all the differences in turnout between the two elections, and this is kind of the unexplained variance, if you like. And for some reason, 1979 is an election where it's very, very high turnout, all other things being equal. Okay, this is what you get when you don't control for efficacy and civic duty. And this is not in the paper that's currently, hopefully, in the final stages of being accepted by political science research methods. This is from an earlier version of the paper, which I really like better in some respects. And you can see here that we're actually getting significant effects for the generational effects now. So we're getting the generations all the way up from pre-1955 to post-1997, and we're getting the effect. So in other words, we do have generational effects, and much of that is associated with efficacy and civic duty, which is exactly what you would expect. So future work, because I don't think we've exhausted the possibilities of analysing this data, I would like to focus more on the generational differences, which has really far more interested me in the first place. What I would also like to do is to bring income back into the model, because most turnout models actually have income in them. And I don't really understand why Franklin didn't include it. It's a conversation I should have with him sometime, perhaps. So anyway, if you introduce income into a model, and this is an earlier model, it's not Bayesian, so we obviously have to rerun it. But what you're seeing here is that, okay, we've got household income from the highest income quintile down to the lowest income quintile. And, okay, there's some text missing here, but basically this grey line that has a significant slope on it is for everybody who entered the electorate in 1997 and after. And this somewhat flatter line is those who entered the electorate before 1997. And you can see that there's, in terms of predicting turnout, you would expect that as income rises, so does turnout. And yes, it does, but the line for the pre-1997 respondents is almost flat. There's a bit of a slope, but there's an obvious slope on the 1997 and after group. And of course, 1997 is a really crucial election in the UK because this is when turnout really fell. And it went down again in 2001. And so my hypothesis is that the big turnout drop in the UK, because if you look at the trend of turnout, really there isn't much of a trend until you get to 1997. And there's a lot of fluctuation, then it drops like a stone from 1997 onwards. And recovers a little bit subsequently, but not by much. So the theory is that the messages that voters are getting who are entering the electorate post-1997 is that politics matters far less than it did. And so they are simply responding to that signal by voting less. So that's probably the next paper that we will try to write from this. I guess we'll probably have to try to introduce 2015 now, which actually would be a good idea because we still don't have quite enough voters who have entered the electorate in 1997. So this is one of the reasons for the wide confidence intervals is that we still don't have quite enough of these people. And 2015 obviously would gather quite a lot more in. I would expect this to be the same in the 2015 election. It was a very small increase in turnout in 2015, but not a very big one, not a very significant one. So my guess is, well, my hope is, I guess, that when we add 2015 and when we apply the more sophisticated methods that we now have to do, that we will continue to see this picture and we'll be able to publish something on that basis. That's it.
On the last picture, so I get the story about the new cohort. People are not turning out as much. And that's really kind of concerning, right? If we think about democracy and things like that. But then but if they're rich, they are turning out. So they're not turning out at any lower level. So there's some sort of message that people who are in the higher classes in the UK entering the electorate, they still seem to think it's their duty, or they're obligated, or they get some benefit from voting while they're. So I don't. That really needs an explanation. It seems to me why that matters so much. And then we should be concerned about that too. If that goes into the future, then we're basically creating a system where the rich vote and the poor don't.
the paper that contains this obviously has a big theoretical section which talks about all of this. But the basic logic is that rich people are still getting what they want out of the system, and so they continue to vote pretty much as they did, whereas poor people are not getting as much out of the system.
Yeah, and if you were older, the sense of duty keeps you from dropping out.
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah. I mean, obviously, there's a control for age in here. Although, well, okay, this model doesn't have a turnout at the previous election variable in it. And when you actually add turnout at the previous election to the model in the first paper, the PSRM paper, the effects of age go away, which is kind of interesting. So they're basically captured by this habit of voting thing. So it would be interesting to add previous turnout to this model. I guess it would make it a little bit more robust, but wouldn't make much difference perhaps. Yeah?
So, fascinating talk about this fascinating project. Looking at this over time, it's a critical part of the story, especially the cohort
Yeah.
idea. So, on some of the results about the effect of competition, competitiveness on different cohorts, I mean, you're seeing that new cohorts, seeing that competition seems to matter more in the first three elections.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering whether these new cohorts have lower turnout already. So therefore they have more room to move, almost like a ceiling effect. So that the old cohorts, their turnout was already so high, so it's going to take monumental change to move them at all from 85 to 90% probability of turning out, versus the newer cohorts, well, there's a lot more room for them to kind of adjust because their turnout is already naturally lower. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I'm not sure what it's like for newer cohorts, but I imagine it's lower. So
Yes.
how do you feel about that?
You're probably right, but I'm not sure that it matters. I mean, that's the short answer. And I'm trying to figure out if I have a longer answer, but I can give you.
The idea would be that what we're witnessing is a function. Why there's a difference between the new and the older cohorts? The idea would simply be, well, the new cohorts, we need to explain why their turnout is low to begin with, not what influences their turnout to change it. But instead, kind of similar to what's going on here, do we need to model why their turnout is low as the first step? And then think about, okay, all else, if their turnout was equal to the others, would these have the same, effect on the remaining?
Yeah. Well, the theory purports to explain why people who are experiencing their first three elections, who tend to be young, are less likely to vote. They are less embedded in the kinds of social networks that tend to promote turnout. And there's an argument here that Franklin also makes that voting at 18 is a particularly bad time to start voting because before the franchise was reduced from 21-year-olds tend to be more embedded in these social networks. They tend to have jobs and possibly not families, but it sets the first three elections back a crucial 3 years, which means that people do tend to have more pressure on them to vote. So one argument that some of you are probably familiar with is that actually 18 is a very bad time to start voting, and actually it should be pushed down to 16 when people are, for the most part, still at school, and therefore school can be used as a way of perhaps promoting turnout, particularly through more effective systems of civic education. Some countries have already reduced voting age to 16 and are trying that out. So there's a theoretical reason, which has a lot of empirical backing, why young people are less likely to vote, and some theories about what can be done about it. So, I mean, I think we do know why it's happening. And, I would agree that, yes, there's certainly more potential for young people to as they get older, to begin to vote. But even the established cohorts, because these habits are gradually working up the generations, arguably there's still some potential for the established cohorts to increase their turnout too. And indeed there is fluctuation across the board. I mean, the established cohorts do respond to short-term competitiveness as well to some degree. So while there's a ceiling effect, I'm not sure that it matters, but it's a good point.
I know very little about UK, but I'm wondering whether I need to notice in the list of factors to take into account anything about immigrants, national origin, ethnic identity, and I wonder if there was information, if that might also play in this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Again, in our original model, we had a variable whether or not someone was born in the UK. Again, this is not one of the things that Franklin includes. So in our original model, that works pretty much as you expect. Yeah, you're born in the UK, you're more likely to turn out to vote. In terms of immigrants, this is a very interesting question in the UK because one problem is that the British government actually doesn't know how many non-citizens there are living in the country because it doesn't actually, it keeps records of people coming into the country, but it doesn't actually keep records of people going out. I had a very interesting conversation with John Curtis, who is one of the main election experts in the UK about this quite recently, and it's quite an interesting problem. So if you're trying to calculate an age-eligible or age citizenship-eligible population on which to calculate turnout in the UK as opposed to those who are on the electoral register, then it's actually quite difficult. International IDEA actually does produce a calculation, but almost certainly it doesn't include immigrants who actually don't have the right to vote. And it's quite complicated because Commonwealth citizens who come to the UK actually do have the right to vote. And so basically, yes, it's a factor, but we don't have very good data on which to assess that. And it might be, for example, because the UK has also changed the way that it is getting people onto the electoral register. It's moving from a household-based registration process to an individual-level basis, and that's been starting to happen in the lead-up to the 2015 election. Now, some argue this will be a better and more comprehensive way of getting people onto the electoral register. Others are more sceptical about that. Electoral boundaries in the UK are also calculated on the basis of the electoral register. So it's actually quite politically important. If the registration process has become less effective, this may be one reason, for example, why turnout appears to go up slightly in 2015. But if you look at the international IDEA estimate, it actually seems to go slightly down. Now, that's probably wrong because it's probably got a lot of immigrants in it, but you actually don't know. We really, to get an estimate of real turnout in the UK, allowing for the fact that the electoral register is not complete, is actually almost impossible. Whereas there's been work in the US which has actually done, I think, a fairly good job. What is it, McDonald and Popkin? Of sorting that out in the US. But in the UK, I don't know where you'd begin. There's a question here, I think. Oh.
So I was wondering that one of the key variables that sort of determines
the policy difference between the parties, yeah.
I was wondering if you are interested in like a generational difference.
You're good.
I was wondering if you're interested in like generational difference. I wonder which policy matters, right? So like if you're younger gen cohort, then like the policy that appeals to you could be very different from like a policies that appeal to older generation. And depending on which policy the parties are polarized, I think that could be what's more better than just like general difference between the parties.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. And one problem is, of course, that political parties know that young people are less likely to vote. And so when they're competing for votes, they're much more likely to be looking at policies that appeal to the people they know actually do vote, as opposed to policies for the people who they know don't, or at least vote less. So there's a tendency for political parties to perhaps not cater to young people in their policy platforms. So that's one of the problems. I mean, the argument that Franklin would make is that, you know, young people, because they're in a period where they're, if you like, sort of finding their footing in society, they're not as integrated into work and society. And so they're actually not aware of policies that parties might have that actually would affect them, but they're simply not getting the message.
Are you thinking that young people are not, they're underestimating how different the parties are? You mean? Is that what you're getting at?
No, because I was wondering, like, at the beginning, the reason why I came up with this question is that at the beginning I was kind of confused at the beginning, like when you say cohort, like, now I know what you mean by cohort.
Yeah.
Like, you're talking about different generations.
Yes.
Before, I was wondering, like, when you say, like, whether competitiveness attract new voters, I was wondering, like, are you including new voters, not only those people who entered the election after a certain year, but also are you talking about voters who didn't vote and then later tried to vote? But then...
Well, both, yes. I mean, new people who entered into, people who acquired the opportunity to vote. So both voters and non-voters. Sorry, that's the idea's a bit unclear. Yeah.
So if you're interested in generation like that, I feel like I don't know, like specific policy should matter, because like when you say there's difference between parties and general policy, I feel like that could be a reason to attract any other voters and not make us like a younger person.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is that, like, I mean, I think as Professor Vowles said, I think there should be more explanation that is more general.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason, like, the reason why we're saying the income impact is higher for younger voters might be because maybe economic issue is more salient to them. I don't know. So I think there is something more.
Yeah. Who was next? Yeah, okay.
If I mischaracterize the structure of your variables or British politics in general...
Well, you don't have the paper, so...
Excuse me.
Yes.
But I'm curious because as I think about British politics, I think about essentially two major parties with a Liberal Democratic Party whose relevance sort of fluctuates from election to election. Could you speak to the challenges of creating a competitiveness index within a system that usually looks like a two-party system, but that has some flexibility built in?
Well, certainly our measure of competitiveness is it's between the first and second place getter, okay? So as far as the seat margins across the whole country are concerned, that's always Conservative and Labor. But of course, in the constituency margins, the second place, the Liberals come first in some constituencies, although not so many in 2015. But of course, they come second in a lot more. And so in that case, the constituency margin does include the Liberal Democrats.
And so in those constituencies where the Liberal Democratic Party performed first or second, survey respondents were asked about the placement of the two parties in a policy space, or? Well,
I'd have to go back. The question that's asked in the BES, I think it starts off by being Labor and Conservative, but I think it may have changed later when the Liberal Democrats came into greater importance. I'd need to go back and check. You know, it's one of those little details that I spent the morning kind of swatting up the paper, and that's one of the little details I didn't confirm. So yeah, that would certainly be worth checking. I mean, it's an imperfect indicator, but it works. It works. Are there any?
Did you look about inequality at all? Changes sort of macro inequality. This is a big.
The other paper starts off with that.
Okay.
And
yeah. This is what interests me the most. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. The other paper starts off with that, and it's quite interesting because you can. I mean, you know, very basic comparison of turnout in the UK and the Gini index. They do tend to track each other, although there's a kind of a delay in the turnout doesn't respond to the big increase in inequality for a couple of elections. So it's almost as there's a kind of delay. So, I mean, basically, I guess I should have, you know, given you a bit more context. I explained earlier about turnout in the UK basically doing its big dive in '97, and then basically sort of stabilising at a lower level. But the Gini index more or less does the same thing. Yeah, it's a little bit earlier, but you know, arguably there's a kind of catch-up effect in this, particularly when you consider it's only affecting, if indeed this is correct, it's only affecting young voters.
I don't study voter behavior, so I'm just curious about what you think the mechanism is that links competitiveness to turnout. So is it that the voter herself is just more interested and perceives that she'll be pivotal? Or is it that the political parties in these constituencies say, let's do the hustings, right? Let's go door to door, and that this is actually an elite level story, particularly through the guns, right?
Yeah.
So is it about the individual or is it about the
Both. I mean, we factor that in. Although, I mean, it's interesting because we have this huge battery of individual level controls, although that excludes a couple of important ones in my view. But anyway, we have a big battery of individual level controls. Some of those probably would be associated with mobilisation. So we're probably underestimating you know, the mobilisation effect simply because of all of these individual level controls. But yeah, it's both. It's both. We're very careful in the article that we say, look, this is not just about pivotality because we understand that not everybody is aware of this. What they are aware of is people banging on their door and asking them to go out to vote and trying to figure out who they're going to vote for and all of that stuff. Yeah.
So, someone who studies only American voter behavior and doesn't look at Europe, I'll ask another question. Do you see instances where the parties will mobilize in a constituency even though they don't think they can win that specific constituency because the national level election is important? So the idea is, you know, this seat is not going to Labour.
Yeah.
Would they go into a constituency that's, you know, heavily conservative because they think the national election will be close? So do door to door and all that stuff.
I think the answer to that is increasingly no. I mean, there is a literature on constituency campaigning in the UK, which I haven't read up in any great detail, but my understanding is that campaigning in the UK has become increasingly targeted in the marginal seats, whereas that wasn't necessarily quite so much the case maybe 20, 30 years ago. Maybe because they probably, well, the parties weren't as centralised in terms of where they decided their resources would go, and they probably weren't as sophisticated in terms of how they targeted seats. So individual MPs would have probably had, they would have had more control over resources, and so even if they didn't need to campaign, they might have done. Whereas I think now it's far more targeted.
So going forward, it could be that you could separate it out. I mean, you have such detailed measures, good measures, of these different forms of competitiveness. One that's more national, driven seats, right?
Yeah.
And the other one that's built on these constituencies. So it could be possible to find these instances where you have a very uncompetitive constituency, and then you can see the effect on voters of that being completely competitive when there's a competitive election.
Yeah, it's possible. Again, there are people who study constituency campaigning, and they interview the agents of the candidates, and people have been working on this in the UK for some years. I'm not sure how far back it goes, and that may be one of the problems, because I think that in the past you may have seen campaigning in electorates where it wasn't necessarily required, but there may be no data from that earlier period, whereas now, as I was saying, it's far more targeted, so there just might be a data problem there.
I would have thought it would be the opposite. I thought maybe that the national vote might have more of an effect on Labour sort of trying to flip the seat in the constituency. To the extent that there is very frequent everyday information about what's going to happen in the national election.
Yeah.
There isn't that information in the constituency level. A savvy pollster, politician might say, "Look, we're going to this is the problem that's going to flip this year. Should we work hard at trying to flip this seat here in this constituency?" I don't know. I have no idea. It'd be an interesting exercise to figure out whether the nationalization and the information overload now in the last few elections actually puts more or fewer resources into really safe seats or truly safe seat kind of.
From what I know, which isn't a great deal, I don't think that's happening.
Okay.
Lord Ashcroft has been doing a lot of constituency level polling and releasing it publicly over the last couple of elections. So there have been these constituency polls. And of course, the data that we use to estimate constituency competitiveness is the closeness of the contest at the previous election. And I think this makes sense because, this is basically the yardstick. So if it was close last time, then it's going to be close this time as well. Extrapolating national trends. And I think the parties are pretty savvy to this. I presume that there's some polling that probably goes on. The parties probably do polling as well in some of these seats too. So if there were seats that they expected to flip, say, on, despite a relatively high margin in the previous election, my guess is that before they committed resources, they'd do some polling. They'd say, is this really worthwhile? Because British parties have become much more centralised in terms of their the decisions that are made in terms of campaigning, like most parties elsewhere.
All right, well, thanks very much, Jack. That's
okay,
great. Appreciate it.
Good. Thank you.